every first single brushstroke on this clean piece of paper always looks dark. It's surprising how light, how brighter these first brushstrokes will look like when the painting is done.
Art in the Making, a podcast about the making process.
Did you mention that I painted the light actually by painting the dark? People often write me that they really like the way I play with light, but the truth is that I play with the dark. So that's my approach to painting light, that in the beginning there is only light. There is this bright white clean paper. That's the brightest light in your entire watercolor painting. And every first single brushstroke on this clean piece of paper always looks dark. It's surprising how light, how brighter these first brushstrokes will look like when the painting is done. And that's how I'm thinking before I start the painting. I already organize a certain light to dark plan. So I look very well to this subject, and I even count those plans. So you have the brightest light and then you have the darker light. The lightest shadows, the darker shadows, and the very dark blacks. The more stops you have in this organized plan, the longer your painting will take. So when you are working outside, you will have less stops in this plan than when you are working in the studio. And as soon as this plan is well organized in my head, I can just concentrate and focus on the painting. And to make this light alive, I try to see what kind of temperature this light has as well. So you have the warm light in the beginning, close to the sun, and that colder light in the sky. And the same goes on here in the painting itself. There are warm reflections on this lantern, for example, and there are colder reflections above, on top of these lanterns. When you make all that light in the same color, it won't become alive. And playing with colored mats is the ending of that story. So this one, for example, it's absolutely not the right color, but maybe the right value, the right tone. So when you frame it later in a colored mat, you really need to take care that you do not use just a bright white mat. It doesn't work, because the white of that mat will even be brighter than the sky, so then the sky will look dark. But you need a mat that let appear the brightness in these shadows as well. So it has to be darker than this whole shadow part in the painting. So all these steps are already well organized before I start. In this painting it was the same, that one of last week, or the week before, I don't know. It's the same story. So I start with that first wash in the sky, and then the next steps are just the darker steps until here. This has become really black, made by brown and blue. And then later I'm really happy with those gouache last tips on the branches and the reflections on the cars and the bicycles, for example. So that's the order in light and dark in watercolor, and in oil and acrylics it's maybe the opposite. So then you often start with the purest, the deepest blacks, and what I often do in oil is put the deepest dark somewhere and the brightest light somewhere, and then I know I then have a reference of dark and light, and then I can play between those two tones. But in watercolor I don't do that, because even the palette is only ready for the darkest tones in the end of the process. Of course, those darkest parts are the driest as well. You don't use less water in those dark parts. So you always start very wet with a lot of water. This whole silhouette of the museum, the Rijksmuseum in the distance, and these classical buildings is very wet. And you can draw a little in the wet paint. You have to know when you do it, because when it's still too wet, your drawing will disappear, of course. And when it's too dry, it will be very hard in the results. So you need to try out when you can put your brush on the wet or half wet paint. And here again there are warm bright lights, different colors, pink, green, and there are those colder, very hard reflections on top of everything. And don't forget that playing it with light brings the depth in the painting as well. So let's see, for example, this dark shade over here, which is the silhouette of the classic architecture here in the distance. These sunscreens really needed to pop out of that dark value over there. When you just focus on both colors, that cold green and that cold yellow, these are not that strong, bright, interesting colors when you look at it closely. Let's try to do something like this. See if that works. Well, you see, this is not a... When you see it together with white, these are even quite grey, dark grey, fluffy colors. Darker than the sky. If I would have put these colors in the sky for a bird, for example, it would be dark enough, I think, for a bird in the distance, a flying bird. But mentioning that these need to pop out, so under it has to be darker than on top or above this sunscreen. Then you see that these are hanging over the darker shadow that they are making themselves, if you know what I mean. So this is the light source, this is light. It's reflecting here in these lines in the windows. And then here it reflects really hard on those sunscreens, but they remain darker than the sky, because these are a reflection of the sky, and the reflection is in most of the time they are darker, and here they are darker because the color of the sunscreens was actually dark enough. And then under it, it has to become almost black. And you need to take care that this black is not as strong and as warm as the blacks over here, because these are in the distance and these are really near, closer to where I was looking at, where I was standing. When this is as hard as this shadow, and it really comes close, but if it was harder than this one, your depth is gone. It's totally lost. It's like sculpting. So when you are sculpting, you always need the light and the shadows. And you only look at light and shadow, and then a whole becomes dark. And everything that pops out becomes light. And there are lots of steps in between. This is the same story. And that makes it that you can see it as a collaboration of all values and colors and temperatures together. Such a tree, for example, when you are really focusing on the tree itself, you see bright, warm reflections on the leaves. But if you paint them and they would become as bright as this one, your painting will fall apart in certain pieces. Because before you make those greens bright, you first have to check the brightest parts in the painting as well. And then you see that when you focus on the tree, the leaves look really bright and shiny. But when you compare it to these sun screens, then you suddenly see that they need to be quite dark. So that sounds like it's really complex, but you hear me talking a lot about these sunscreens. So from the moment you have a certain reference, and that's always the sky first, that's the light source, then the ground, because that's the first thing that reflects the light. And then one or two reference in your dark parts, then you can start counting in the dark and light steps.